All right, as I mentioned, the Justice Committee has begun. They began on Monday, hearing submissions on the Treaty Principles Bill. Over 80 hours will be heard from a potpourri of people. Began on Monday, as I said, with 8.5 hours of submissions. They broke for only half an hour to take lunch. The chair, National MP James Meagher, says in every parliament and with every bill considered, there was a balance between allowing every single person to have their say and letting Parliament do its job. ACT leader David Seymour, the architect of the bill, kicked off the submissions. He said, amongst other things, that New Zealand had been split into two groups, land people and treaty people. He also said, some say this bill will not pass this time. We shall see. He pointed out that the abolition of slavery in the UK, homosexual law reform and the end of life choice in New Zealand did not succeed on their first attempts either. And there is a feeling it won't pass when you've got heavyweights such as the Prime Minister and a leader of the other party in the coalition not supporting it, in fact running the other way as fast as their little legs will carry them. New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters said it's dead in the water and it will never go past its first reading, while Christopher Luxon reiterated his earlier stance, saying National won't support the bill, it will be voted down and it won't become law. Professor Elizabeth Rata is a curriculum expert at the University of Auckland. She's also an author, a media commentator, and she presented her oral submission on Monday, and she joins me now. Elizabeth, a very good afternoon to you.
Oh, good afternoon, Leah.
I know you're not a stranger to the platform, but it's the first time that we're chatting, so I'm really, really pleased that you made time for me, so thank you very much. Elizabeth, before we start on your submissions and your thoughts, how was the atmosphere in the room when you were giving your submission?
Oh, I did it by Zoom.
Ah, yeah. How was the atmosphere in your room on Zoom?
It was pretty good.
And you obviously got to say what you wanted to say, and no one butted in. Were there questions given to you, or do you just read and say what you want to say?
No, I spoke for about 5 minutes, and then there were a couple of questions. Yeah, so
Okay.
It was very effective.
Right. You opened your submission, Elizabeth, with the 1877 Education Act, an act to make further provision for the education of the people of New Zealand. Can you elaborate for us, Elizabeth, what was or is this act and why you felt it was so important to kind of open your submission with?
Yeah, I would like to talk a little bit about that act. I just think it's an incredible piece of legislation. I mean, there's this country. We didn't have sewage systems, we didn't have sanitation systems, but people were so committed to education that we had a national education system as early as 1877. Mind you, there were schools prior to that. There were also the native schools from the Act of 1867, but to have a national system of education so early in our nation's history is quite remarkable. And something else that I'd like to say about that legislation is it really epitomises the strong sense of liberal tolerance that 19th century New Zealanders, both Māori and colonialists, had. For example, there were a number of exemptions for children who couldn't go to school or whose parents didn't want them to go to school. For example, if there was the geography made it impossible to actually get to the school. If you didn't want your child being taught what was considered an English version of history, you could withdraw your child from history classes. For Māori, there was an extension from the compulsory requirement right through to 1903 to recognise that although most Māori parents wanted their children to go to school, there were some, of course, Waikato, Taranaki, who didn't. So there's that sense of, we want to get the social contract working, we want people to agree to build this fledgling nation, but we recognise that there are some people who can't or who won't, and let's just have a little bit of allowance. And I think that one of the strengths of liberal democracy is that, there is this flexibility. So, of course, we can't be too flexible. We can't have too much tolerance, because at that point, if you think of W.B. Yeats, things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. So there has to be sufficient stability to the centre so that we can allow exemptions.
Okay, I see. Yeah, right. Also in your presentation, Elizabeth, you said that there were those who would replace liberal democracy with tribal sovereignty, and by doing so create a racialised society or apartheid. And that's a strong word, apartheid. But do you believe that is where we could be headed?
I don't think it's a strong word. I think it's a precise term for dividing a country into two groups based on genetic ancestry. That's what it says. And yes, I think we are in real danger. I've been doing, as well as my curriculum research, I've also been studying the rise of what I call the neo-tribal elite since the 1990s. So I've written a lot about it, and I've thought deeply about it. And this is what happens when you get a group of people who are an emergent elite, who are about acquiring power and resources, and who use various ideologies to do it. In the New Zealand case, the ideology is the return of the traditional, and the mechanism is treaty revisionism. And we've seen treaty revisionism since the 1980s. And so if we do end up with a retribalised state, we can't have liberal democracy. I mean, they're incompatible. You just can't have both. And that was the point I made in my submission.
So you talk obviously liberal democracy, it offers rights to individuals rather than groups. And could you elaborate on why you believe this distinction is crucial for our future?
Yeah, it's really important because it's the individual who holds the political and legal rights. And if those rights are given to a group, you can end up with the weaker ones in the group, the powerless ones in the group, not actually being able to exercise those rights. So it's absolutely crucial that political and legal rights adhere to the individual. They're my rights, they're your rights. But liberal democracy does allow for, and must have, this social contract of just as we are concerned about ourselves, we can't develop as individuals if we don't have a strong society, prosperous society. So there's that commitment to the society as well. So I would see, also, for example, the purpose of education is to do the two things: to individualise us by enabling us to, be able to think, and also to socialise us so that we can work, that we can be part of our society. And liberal democracy has what's known as sort of voluntary associations, where you can belong to, a heritage group, a culture, a sport, whatever you want to. But the difference between an essential group is with a voluntary association, you can choose to join and you can choose to leave. But when it's a group based on ancestry, that's it. You're there because of your ancestry. So it's a huge difference between the types of, the essential group and the liberal democratic association.
And you highlighted the combination of equal rights and individual freedoms, and said it was the foundation of a vibrant society. How do you then propose balancing these principles with the recognition of cultural identities? Can they be in the same realm?
Yeah, well, that's the beauty of liberal democracy, because they can. You can, as well as being an individual in your voluntary association, and we see it with religion. You can still belong to a religion, and in fact, you can say my identity is that of my religion or that of my culture, but that might be your identity, your personal, your social identity, but your legal and political identity, or I should say rights, come from the political system. the democratic political system. So identity, yeah, of course, in civil society, in the public realm, yeah, I mean, identify whatever way you want to.
Sure. We know that nowadays.